I lived in an apartment about a few years ago. 4 units upstairs, 4 units downstairs. I lived upstairs, and the apartment below me was vacant. I kept hearing footsteps throughout the apartment, and I knew I shouldn't have. Nobody was downstairs. I asked someone to come over and listen just to see if I was crazy. Maybe I'm just hearing other apartments since it's empty downstairs and everything is echoing. Wrong. I kept hearing the footsteps. This went on for a solid hour. Finally, I called the landlord and the police. Apparently, someone had broken in through the windows downstairs and was walking back and forth through the apartment with a knife. Horrifying. While living with some friends, I got up late at night to get a drink of water from the kitchen. I didn't turn on any lights, having no trouble navigating in the dark. As I crossed through the living room, I heard some movement type noise or something and assumed it was one of my roommate's pet cat. Go to the kitchen, drink water, leave the kitchen. On my way back through the living room, I hear a movement noises a lot louder than the old cat should make, and I glance around. There on the couch, in the very dark living room, is a shape, roughly child-sized, with bright red eyes staring directly at me. I froze. The fear was so sudden and so strong that it is in fact giving me goosebumps right now. I very slowly stepped backwards, not daring to even blink, as I watched the red orbs watch me. After several gazingly long seconds, I reached the kitchen light switch, ready to defend myself when this goblin thing was sure to attack me. Click. It was my other roommate's chinchilla. It had opened its cage and escaped from their room. It was sitting on top of a pile of laundry. My bedroom is on the second floor of the house. There's no patio, porch, overhang of any kind beneath my windows. A couple of years ago, I was watching TV in bed around 2 a.m. Heard a louder than usual animal sound. Not uncommon to hear squirrels running around on the roof from time to time. Didn't think much of it. Kept on happening, and started to sound awfully close to the window and not on the roof. I ignored it for a pretty long time. After at least 40 to 45 minutes of being irritated by the noise, best guess, I had watched a couple of episodes of South Park on my DVR during the time span. Banged on the wall in hopes of scaring them off until I could get to sleep. Just 2 quick bangs with my fist, which were answered from 2 bangs on the wall right next to the window from the outside. Needless to say, just about shit and jumped out of my bed. Now, my living room has a bay window and is on the other end of the house, so I could look out from that window from the side and see my bedroom window. I hustle downstairs and peek out. I see a guy standing in front of my house below my bedroom window. He's got a knife, small pocket knife in his hand, and he's petting the front of my house. Call the police and wait. He never leaves the front of the house even when they roll up and ultimately disarm him and arrest him without much struggle. I was about 19, living with a roommate, going to college, while living in an apartment complex. Occasionally, I get mild bouts of insomnia, but nothing serious. Usually just a delay in my bedtime of an extra 2 or 3 hours. One night, I suddenly just cannot sleep. Nothing will get me to relax. I eventually give up and just sit in the front room playing Heavy Rain all night, as it had just come out a few days ago. The next day when I head off to work exhausted with 0 hours of sleep, I got a text from my roommate. Dude, the police are all over the apartment complex. Apparently 9 apartments including our downstairs neighbor were broken into last night with people home sleeping. Some people even reported things being stolen from the rooms they were sleeping in. It hit me that had I not stayed up all night and left the light on in the front room, I would have been robbed, or worse. I was living in Fort Wayne for a short time, and the house I stayed in was on the outskirts of the main city, set way back on a dirt road in Farmville. The house is over 200 years old, and I would routinely freak myself out because of the age, location, and my only other roommates were two cats. Anyways, during one of the coldest nights in January, -15 Fahrenheit, I heard someone frantically ringing my doorbell at 2:30 to 3 a.m. Slowly approaching the door to get a glimpse of an unexpected company before they realized I could see them. Suddenly, I heard them thump across the wooden wrap around the deck leading up to the front door and make their way to the big glass side door. I heard a moan and a groan. I heard someone jiggle the doorknob. By this time, I am calling the cops and cowering in my room with my pistol drawn. During the 25 minutes it took for the cops to make their way up there to investigate, I could hear and see shadows of people outside each window, trying each one to see if it slid open. When the cops arrived, they walked around the house and only identified one set of footprints in the snow and one set of drag marks. Also, they could identify where and when the person being dragged was seated down in the snow at various entry points while the other guy was checking for a way in. Moved shortly after, not because of the attempted entry, but because Fort Wayne is a terrible place to live. We moved into a new house a few months ago. As we were in the process of purchasing the house, the renter who was living in it died unexpectedly of natural causes in his mid-40s. He died right in the middle of the living room. Shortly after, we moved into the house, and almost immediately our 2-year-old daughter starts talking about the ghost that lives in our house. Now let's be real here. She is 2, and 2-year-olds are very impressionable. Halloween had recently passed, and she had this Halloween-themed picture book that she loved to read. So it's entirely possible that all this talk of ghosts was just coming from looking through that book on a regular basis. Still, she was always telling me that the ghost was in her playhouse in the basement, or that the ghost was on the stairs, or that the ghost was standing in the corner. She never seemed to be afraid of the ghost, and considered him to be her friend. So I wasn't at all concerned even if there really was a ghost haunting our house. If it's a nice and helpful ghost, it could certainly be a lot worse. I would often tell the ghost that he was welcome to stay if he wanted to, but he was also welcome to go if that would make him happier. I was about 30 to 70 on the ghost being real, and she could see and talk to him versus the ghost just being her imagination fueled by her Halloween book. Until one day, when we were going to the car to go to the daycare in the morning. It was still dark out and rainy. My daughter told me that the ghost was on the back deck, and then she told me that today was the ghost's birthday and she wanted to sing him happy birthday. Once again, I mostly disregarded what she was saying, as she is birthday obsessed and has in the past made us sing happy birthday to a Mickey Mouse, a bowl of fruit snacks, and the bathroom. So we sang and wished the ghost a happy birthday and went on with our lives. Later that day, out of pure curiosity, I looked up the obituary of the man who had died in our house. And wouldn't you know it, it was his fucking birthday. I work in a small building with 3 wings, and my office is located in a little back hallway of one of the wings. I share the office with another girl, and it's usually pretty quiet. One evening, she and I were the only ones in our wing still there. We both heard a door loudly shut in the hallway. We were both a bit confused, and upon peeking out, I noticed nothing out of the ordinary. The next 2 weeks, I was staying really late to catch up on hours so I could have a winter break. I began noticing little noises in the hallway when I was positive nobody was in the building. Sounded like a shoe sliding on the floor. This happened a couple times. Earlier in the evenings, it would just be me and the janitor, and she started really getting spooked. She said she heard doors slamming in one of the wings even though everybody had left. We investigated one night to find that all of the doors were properly locked, but I noticed that the kitchen light was on, even though the door was locked. The janitor freaked out because she knew she'd turn off the light before locking the door. I also recalled the light being on a couple of nights when I was the only one there. Started to ask around if other people in the building had experienced anything weird like that, and one lady said some of her room decorations would have moved when she came back from the bathroom. Here's the one that really creeps me out. Another lady said that one day she noticed a footprint in the middle of her desk. It's that black material that shows skin prints really easily. To be honest, I'd rather it be paranormal stuff, because the idea that there's a person doing all this really creeps me out. This story is not mine, it's my grandfather's. Backstory. This takes place in West Virginia in the 20s. My grandpa is the youngest of 9 and his family is very poor. They all live in a one-room house. My grandpa's sister suddenly got sick and quickly fell into a coma. They said she had a fever and would shake and even sit up in the middle of the night, even though she was not conscious. She got progressively worse over the next few days and needed some sort of help. My grandpa and his oldest sister Glenna stayed behind while the rest of the family went to the neighbor's house 10 miles down the road for some food and medicine. As soon as the family got home that night, their mom went to the sister's bed and started to put a cold cloth on her head. Immediately, her eyes flew open for the first time in days. She looked at her mother right in the eyes and said, "The Lord wants Glenna." She fell back and twitched before going back into unconsciousness. Next morning, Glenna and the sister had died. The younger sister died from fever, and Glenna died from unknown causes. This reminds me of something that supposedly happened to my uncle 30-something years ago in a small Colombian town called Oroque, as told by my mother. It's an unbelievable story to the point that I really doubt its occurrence. This uncle, like all my uncles save two, was a doctor. At the time, he was the equivalent of a general practitioner, although he later became a pediatrician. He was young at the time, and just 3 years out of med school. Like many young doctors, he was always eager to prove himself, often at the risk of his own health. This was one of those occasions. After being forced by my grandmother to take a much-needed 2-week vacation, he developed a fever. He, being the cocky young man that he was, refused to admit that he was sick until he literally fainted while attending a patient. He ends up hospitalized for 3 or 4 days, at which point it seemed he would die. My grandmother, aunt, and mother all traveled to the hospital, which was pretty far away. They took up residence in a nearby hotel. Eventually, my grandmother decides that her son spends his last days with them in the hotel, under the care of a nurse. My uncle's quite delirious at this point, so a priest comes, gives him the last rites, and the waiting begins. About a week after the fainting, some of my uncle's colleagues visit him to say their last goodbyes. One of them tells my mom of an unorthodox last-ditch solution: bring in a medium. Here's where things get really wild. This medium, who may have been a practitioner of the cult of Maria Leonza, was a middle-aged woman who supposedly could channel the spirit of a famous Venezuelan doctor and saint named Jose Gregorio Hernandez, who died in 1919. There were certain things she would need to summon the saint, including a stipulation to leave her alone with the patient, a notepad with a pen, and certain local plants which were to be collected by her assistant. My grandmother and her daughters were desperate at this point, so they agreed. They leave the medium alone and wait outside a few hours until the woman emerges. My mother claims that she could hear the voice of an older man murmuring from the inside of a room. The medium comes out and gives them the notepad with a set of instructions. The instructions were for what I suppose could be called a herbal potion. She took no money and left after eating a nice meal paid for my family. Meanwhile, her assistant prepared the potion, which was to be given to my uncle every 4 hours. Although it took another week, my uncle eventually recovered for the most part, only losing sight in his left eye. He was fired from the hospital he worked at for working with a fever, at which point he left for the capital, Bogota, and began his specialization in pediatric medicine. His brothers, at this point already established doctors, helped him find a new job despite his incredibly irresponsible actions. Note, I am not in any way defending what they did. He is retired a few years ago. Is this story true? I have no clue, as I didn't even exist. Even as a child, this story seems extremely unlikely, but there's always something in the way my mom told it that always creeped me out. Like I said before, it's an unbelievable story, the type of story that you just start laughing at if you saw it on a late night television. No, I am not lying. I did not just make that story up 5 minutes ago. It's something that my mother has told me a few times since I was a child, and consistently as well. Did she make it up? Maybe, but I sure as hell didn't think that's for sure. One I posted nearly a year ago that could do with the dusting off. Quite a few years ago now, I found myself working at a historical goal, prison museum for you USA types, as a guide/administrator. This place was one of the oldest buildings in town and had quite the reputation amongst ghost hunters, so it was always spooky working there. The early days had been fairly violent and there had been quite a few deaths, including state-ordered hangings, so there were plenty of ghostly stories passed around. While I did see some very odd things during my time there, the building was old, a haven for local wildlife, and far from windproof, so any stories had to be taken with a grain of salt. We also had several dozen mannequins set up in traditional poses, a few gathered in the courtyard, some in the cells, and it was always fun to hear the gasps from tourists when they saw the first one looming in the hallway. Now to the story. As this was primarily a tourist town, the winter months were quite quiet, and I could go hours without seeing another person. One day I had lucked out and managed to get a late closing one night and an early morning opening the next day. Both closing and opening required a torch as it was pitch black at this time of the year and lights were not installed throughout the entire complex. I only had one tourist the entire day, so to defeat boredom, I decided to take one of the surplus mannequins from the storeroom and dress them in some early convict ladies' garb and set them up in the kitchen in the ladies' wing. I decided I would set them up facing away from the door, holding a bowl in one arm and an egg beater in the other. I made sure everything was very sturdy and closed up the kitchen for the night. Next morning, I arrived at 6 a.m. to open up and was making my way through the complex when I heard something strange. The room I was in shared a wall with the kitchens, and there was an odd scraping noise coming from the other side of the wall as I stood there listening in the dark. It stopped, started again, then intensified, accompanied by a tapping noise. A little freaked out, I continued around the building. It was set up in circular shape with rooms on the inside. making my way slowly towards the kitchens. As I stood outside the door, I could hear this irregular noise quite clearly and decided to use the sliding hatch on the door to look into the room first. The mannequin was moving, not just moving slightly, but quite visibly tapping one foot up and down as it slowly turned the egg beater, its arms raising and lowering. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, my brain started to process what I was seeing. Whether possession or poltergeist, I was not sticking around for this thing to turn around. I slammed that hatch closed and hightailed it back the way I came, not stopping until I reached the main office, where I promptly bolted the door and turned on every light I could find. At around 10 a.m., we had our first tourists come through the doors. I'd convinced myself by this point that surely what I had seen had been some sort of hallucination. I must have heard the building settling and my brain filled in the rest. It was dark after all. Knowing I would have to open the kitchen for the tourists to pass through, I hung the "back in 5 minutes" sign on the front desk and snuck quietly towards the kitchen door. Slowly opened the hatch and peered in to see the mannequin standing in the same position that I had left it, not moving. With everything back to normal, I breathed a very deep sigh of relief and opened the door. The second I opened the door, the mannequin began to mix the egg beater, frantically tapping its foot. I have never been more terrified than at the moment. It was broad daylight. Couldn't convince myself nothing was happening this time. It was happening right in front of me. I was alone in the goal and with a possessed mannequin, and I was the only authority figure with an innocent member of the public soon to be coming through this very room. What the hell was I supposed to do in this situation? I remember thinking, it's only plaster and paper mache. Just kill it. Smash it quickly, run like hell, and never come back. As I picked up a meat mallet and walked, extremely hesitantly, towards the thing. As I got closer, began moving quicker until I was within reaching distance. Fully expecting this thing to turn around and bury the egg beater in my chest, I grabbed a hold of its arm only to have the mannequin erupt into a terrible, croaking, hissing noise. I near crapped myself at this point, but something about the hissing sounded surprisingly familiar. Gaining some composure, I looked into the bowl the mannequin was holding in its other arm. Looking up at me, with its head stuck firmly between the beaters, was a king skink, about 40 centimeters long. Took my hand off the mannequin's arm, and the skink began to run. Stuck as it was, it ran around in circles in the bottom of the bowl, which turned the beater attached to the mannequin's arm, which proceeded to move up and down and caused the whole thing to vibrate, tapping its foot on the ground. 5 minutes later, I was letting the poor guy go in the courtyard while still giggling hysterically to myself, and by the end of that day, that mannequin was packed up and back in storage, just in case. Posted a couple times before, but definitely the freakiest shit I've ever experienced. This happened my senior year of college, Christmas break of 2016. I worked for a professor that asked me to house and dog sit for him while he was out of town to see the bowl game that we were in. He was gone for 3 days and had a huge piece of land in the middle of nowhere. I invited my girlfriend at the time. He had horses and fishing and a gator to ride around on, etc. So the first 2 nights went down with no incident, but the last night, his little floofy dog is having a fit. She keeps barking at the back door. At first we blow it off, but decide to lock the dog inside in case of a coyote or something. After a while we start to get a little creeped out. Keeps saying it's probably an animal and we'll be fine. My girlfriend, not too bright, wants to go investigate and see what's outside. So I lock the door behind her. Just kidding. She goes outside and says she saw something small and gray, probably a coyote, and it ran off. So, just an animal, no worries. but by this time we're pretty spooked. The dog now starts barking at the window on the other side of the house. We're still trying to ignore it, but a little worried. We decide to get into bed. Awkward silence. And then I hear it. Sounds like a young girl singing a soft, eerie lullaby. I don't say anything, hoping that my mind is playing tricks on me. My girlfriend says, "Let's get the F out of here." I say, "Why?" She says, "You didn't hear that little girl singing?" Okay, let's get the F out. And we got the F out. I even called someone to talk to me while we walked out to my car. Next morning, went to clean up the house and such. Most scared I've ever been. Ever. My paternal grandmother died when I was 6. I lived in New York. She lived in PA. I met her maybe twice. I was 6 years old, asleep in bed one night, and for whatever reason I woke up and walked into my parents' bedroom. My father had an easy chair in one corner for reading. I sat in the chair. On the opposite wall was my father's closet. It opened, and Grandma came out and stood about 6 feet away. "I just wanted to say goodbye," she said. Smiled, waved, and turned back and walked back into the closet, closing the door behind her. I went back to my room. About 2 hours later, about 6 a.m., the phone rings. It was a call from PA that Grandma Catherine had died in her sleep. My mother came to wake me up to tell me, and I said, "I know." "What do you mean?" "She came to say goodbye last night." She made me repeat the story 3 times, and then told me never, ever tell my father that story. And I never did. I've posted this before in a similar thread. For reference, this happened a few months ago. Like most couples, my husband and I have a designated side of the bed. I sleep on the right and him on the left. My comfortable sleep position is laying on my left side and facing the window, away from him. He alternates between facing the bathroom door or me. One night a few weeks back, I'm fighting my sleep, laying on my left side per the norm, but I just can't get comfortable. My neck is sort of sore from laying on my left, so I turn over and face my husband. When I turn over, I am not only faced with my husband's back, but with a large shadow standing over him. Immediately, the shadow stretches to me and somehow communicates for me to turn over. I remember thinking his face was contorted somehow, expressing malice, but I can't for the life of me remember what it looked like. Didn't hear a voice, but the communication was urgent and angry, like it wanted to hurt me. Without thinking, I turned back around and quickly fall asleep. To be honest, I'm not even sure if I was dreaming. The next morning, my husband and I wake up around the same time and go about our usual routine. I don't say anything because my husband doesn't like to talk about supernatural stuff or the like, which I felt it was. However, this morning is strange and he seems to be uncomfortable. After a lot of prodding, he finally admits he had an awful nightmare. Dreamt a demon was trying to make him do things while he was sleeping. Really evil shit, wouldn't elaborate. I woke up during this and the demon attacked me. I didn't tell my husband that I remember the same thing, only I wasn't sure if I was asleep.